Okay, well, welcome everybody for another conversation on the future of work. And I want to quickly thank the National Science Foundation for partially funding this effort. And of course, just to mention, this is recorded. And if you have questions, then please put them in the chat and Orit will be monitoring that and moderating that soon. And welcome, Jen. Let me just quickly introduce our guest. Jen Golbeck is a professor at the University of Maryland in College Park, and she's the director of the Social Intelligence Lab. She's an expert on social networks, social media, privacy, and security on the web. She's known for her work in computational social network analysis. And if you like dogs, there are a couple of dogs, I think, in there too. So please take a look at the Golden Ratio 4 on Twitter. You can also follow her at Jen Runs with Dogs. And we were just talking about another thing that you just started. So we can mention that as well in our conversation. But Jen, I wanted to start with thinking about, you were writing about, exploring the pitfalls and the advantages of personalization algorithms. And you recently wrote about how these algorithms really try to maximize engagement online. And they do this for profit, but you suggest that there are other ways that the algorithms could be written. So can you tell us more about this?
Yeah. So, there's been a lot of research into what's the impact of social media on us. Even before we got as algorithmically driven as we are now, like earlier days of, say, Facebook, what's the impact of seeing all this stuff on Facebook? Because you're seeing your friends on vacation and your friends' new houses and all of these great moments in their lives. How does that make us feel? The results are really mixed, but there's definitely a thread of research that has shown that it can lower self-esteem, especially among teenagers. It can make you feel like you're not doing that great because you see this curated highlight reel of everybody's lives. And so, I had followed that line of research and was really interested in what's the impact that this technology has on us psychologically. But I don't want to replicate, what very smart people are doing in that space of actually measuring that impact. But it sort of raised the question, if we look at different kinds of content, does that make us feel differently? Facebook had done a frankly, really unethical study, in my opinion, where they had done what they called a social contagion study. They showed some people just kind of neutral to happy stuff for a week and some people neutral to sad stuff for a week. They were trying to counter this argument that Facebook made you sad. We can talk if you want all about why it was both a crappy experiment and unethical. But the idea there was interesting. Does what you see impact how you feel? And so I was wondering, can we measure that? So I did a study with dogs, actually, and I said, okay, I'm going to have people come in. I'm going to measure, how do they feel right now? What's their sense of well-being, happiness, feeling contented and safe? I'm going to measure that, and then I'm going to have them look at different sorts of stuff. Some people will look at dogs. Some people just look at kind of funny posts. Some people are going to read Donald Trump's Twitter feed. And then I'll have them do that for 5 minutes and see how they feel again. Do they feel better? Do they feel worse? Does it not matter? Not surprisingly, people who looked at dogs and funny stuff felt better. People who read Trump's Twitter feed felt worse. Even Trump supporters felt worse, right? Because he makes you angry about stuff. And so that was on one hand, not at all surprising. On the other hand, it says, depending on what we show people, it can impact how they feel. And so could we create algorithms, essentially recommender systems, personalization algorithms that are optimizing for something other than how long are you going to stay on this site? How long are you going to keep scrolling? And instead optimize on, say, can I show you stuff that's going to make you feel better? So if you just feel like you suck, you push the button and it's going to show you stuff that improves your self-esteem or that makes you happier. The research we've done so far says, yeah, that actually would work. We can do that on a personalized basis. And so, I haven't solved the profit problem, but it suggests that there's a lot of ways that we can use exactly the same algorithms, but just the thing they're optimizing for, instead of being that time spent on the site or number of clicks, can be how good do you feel? And that seems promising.
So you mentioned the profit problem, and there is this profit problem, right? Because if I understand it correctly, there's this, that is at the very essence of what the companies are doing. The way that they've built everything is engagement. So do you have any ideas on how to get around this?
I mean, it's a huge problem, and not just like, oh, people have lower self-esteem because they see all these beautiful, happy moments from people's lives. If we look at, say, the last year or two, um, misinformation is largely driven by engagement. Extremism is driven by engagement. The Wall Street Journal had a really interesting article where they had obtained copies of internal Facebook presentations where, for example, Facebook found that, I don't have the exact numbers on the top of my head, but it was definitely the majority, something like 65% of people who join right-wing extremist groups on Facebook do so because the Facebook algorithm tells them to join those groups, because it gets you more engaged. You spend more time looking at that stuff. And Facebook very explicitly made the decision to not investigate this anymore and not do anything about it. And we've seen that in a lot of spaces with vaccine misinformation, even before COVID, that people who just kind of casually come into sites are driven to this more conspiracy theory, extreme stuff, even if they don't agree with it, because it makes them angry, it keeps them more engaged. So there's a real social problem that comes out of optimizing for engagement. At the same time, it's how the sites make money, as you totally noted. So what do we do about that? I don't really know. I wish I had a good solution for it. But I think it's probably going to have to involve some kind of shift in how these companies are getting the majority of their money. Right now they make more profit if you stay on the site longer, and there's really no incentive to like have them be socially responsible with it. I can't think of a way to force that social responsibility on them that would be legal in the US. And so we have to think about like, what are alternative ways to fund this? Look, here's an example that I don't know that I think is a good idea, but is an interesting thought exercise. Someone had sort of proposed that you can't really opt out of social media at this point. Like, it's a really critical way of communicating with people. So maybe it's as necessary as a utility. And maybe we have something like the post office social media site that's like free. It's not monitored. There's all of these really strict privacy protections. There's no advertising in there. Like, companies may be able to pay to use services, but it's essentially provided as a utility. And then there may be private competitors to it, but there's this sort of public option that a lot of people can use. I don't know if that's the right way to do it. But I think we have to think in those sorts of creative ways about alternatives, because the current setup we know isn't working for society or for individuals. It's really just working for the companies.
So you mentioned the research that you conducted on, how different things make people feel. And I really, there's a parallel to in your own work, right? Because you're talking to Brian Williams on the 11th hour about QAnon. And I think all of us, as you said, no matter where we stand, it makes us feel uneasy and not necessarily happy to think about QAnon. And then at the same time, you have your wonderful dogs. And whenever I look at your dogs, it's just joy, right? So yeah. I think it's this really neat thing that you are an influencer, and you have these two kind of extremes, I guess, that you're looking at. And I'm curious, what can you tell us about this line of work of being an influencer? What does that mean? What does it take? And what are some of the things that made you happy about being able to accomplish within this line of work?
It's very strange, I gotta say. So yeah, my dogs are way more famous than me. Their Twitter, or their handles everywhere is the Golden Ratio 4. So they're on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter. They're everywhere. And I actually started it because of the bad stuff, right? I've always spent a lot of my research time studying what I call malicious online behavior. So that includes things like bots and harassment, but it involves me spending a lot of time just kind of casually murking around in the really terrible parts of the internet to see what people are doing, which is really trying. And it became overwhelmingly difficult for me after the 2016 election. Like, the lead up to it was bad, but once Trump was elected, everybody was angry everywhere. Like, the Trump supporters were angry at everything in the world. And then the non-Trump supporters were really angry and worried about what was coming next. And I was like, I just need a place to get away from this. Like, my life was really consumed with, I mean, I was angry too, right? But then also like absorbing everybody else's anger. So at the time I had 4 golden retrievers, and I was like, I'm just going to post pictures of them and curate this very happy community. Anyone who comes in with nonsense, block them. And it really built a culture around it. So I was like, maybe we'll get like 10,000 followers on this account. Like, that would be interesting. And we kind of integrated creating that content into our daily life. Like I always took pictures of them anyway. We got on Snapchat, which was, much bigger then than it is now, but we still use it to do these sort of day in the life. We show ourselves like feeding them dinner and playing fetch with them. And we have now 400,000 followers on Snapchat, about 150,000 on Twitter and Instagram. We're in the creator fund on TikTok, getting paid for those videos. We've done live shows with them. Like we, sold out theaters to have the dogs on the stage. And I think people frankly just come to pet the dogs afterwards. But people recognize us like in airports and stuff. Well, without the dogs, they're just like, oh, like those are your dogs. I love your dogs. It's crazy. It's very weird to kind of have this status of like low grade celebrity because of my dogs. But on the other hand, it's great. Like we have, because I pay attention to a lot of this stuff, I've been able to very intentionally curate a good community. We do, like anybody who comes in with like, arguing with people, insulting people, like we kick them out. And so even though there's 150,000 followers or whatever on Twitter, all of those are positive conversations. There's no argument. And our followers are really appreciative of that they're all really supportive of each other. So they do fundraisers for each other. We have all these dogs. We have 6 right now because we adopt, or we foster and then always pretty much adopt special needs. So they tend to be old and sick or both. So we lose them a lot. It's rare that we get to have them for more than a year. And when we lose them, it still sucks. And the kind of outpouring of support that we get, I think anyone who's had a pet and they die, it is this huge event in your life, but it's not an event that gets the kind of social attention that losing a human person in your life gets, even though in some cases it's worse. It can feel worse to lose your pet than like an uncle that you kind of knew from childhood. And so to have all these people mourn with us and give us that sort of support, it's this like really amazing corner of social media, and having it present in my everyday life kind of reminds me that even though so much of our attention is focused on all the bad stuff that comes from social media, the stuff people are doing and the implications, there's also tremendously good stuff it has brought to the world, and I get to play in that space. It's a really nice psychological balance for me.
So given that you are an influencer, you've carefully thought about your responsibilities. And I think some of that you were just mentioning, but I'm curious, what do you feel you're responsible for, and how do you act responsibly?
So it's a really good question. So I kind of do this in a couple spaces. So, we have the dog accounts. You also mentioned I have this running account. Jen runs with dogs. So I run ultra marathons. It's much less popular than the dog stuff, but I sort of tweet or post about my running adventures, and I do that all over. So I have a sponsorship there from a shoe company, which is interesting. And I've had lots of people offer to do sponsorships with us on the dog channel and on the running channel. That's a thing I think really carefully about. And I've only taken a couple because I don't want to get into that space of like pushing products on people, especially because like I'm a full professor, like I'm an established professional. And our followers on both places tend to be younger. They tend to be like, a lot of them are in college. Some of them are recent graduates. So like, to be very blunt about it, like I have more money than our followers do, right? So I don't need to be pushing stuff onto them. And that's a big factor in a lot of the considerations. Like people normally who would be in our position would probably have a Patreon, because we do spend a lot of time on it. And it's a way to get people to support it. And we've discussed it and very explicitly made the choice not to do that, because we think it's the wrong way for money to be flowing from our, we have a very comfortable life, my husband and I. We don't need to be taking money from, people who are paying off student loans to support us sending pictures of our dogs. And then, in terms of like, so that's kind of the financial, like business work side of being an influencer, right? You have to make a lot of those choices. And then on the community side, on all the accounts, like I work pretty hard to make the right choices. So, for the community of dog people, and that carries into the running account, to make it a very positive, supportive place. But in my professional tweeting and posting, as we were talking before we started, my TikTok has been going for like 20 days and I have like 150,000 followers on TikTok where I'm talking about science, like that's a really kind of different kind of discussion that I want to have there. Like I want people to raise questions and challenge things and ask for sources and have debates. So I can't just knock out anybody who says something impolite, but I do knock out anybody who says stuff that's wrong, right? If someone comes in and is like, this thing you said about vaccines is, I posted when I got my Moderna shot last week, I did a video that I posted up on TikTok and someone's like, I'm not getting that thing, like that's gonna make you infertile. And I was like, delete that comment. Because all that does is create confusion. If they'd asked a question, that'd be fine. But keeping the misinformation out of there is an important thing. So yeah, I think a lot about how to curate the community and to kind of give people what they need and what's responsible from that.
And to follow up on that, a lot of us are in the human computer interaction space, and a lot of us talk about AI, and we kind of talked about this, how companies make money. So what can we learn for our own efforts as we all create systems from what you just described? Are there lessons that we can learn and try to apply that in how we act as designers of things that people use?
I mean, one thing I think is interesting to think about in this space, or maybe this is two things. The line that you get when you push for privacy, because I think like better data privacy and control over our data, like if we got whatever the American equivalent of a GDPR is, I think that would address a lot of the stuff that upsets people. If we had really easy, straightforward ways to say, you may not use my data for any of this, like you can't do that. I think that would solve a lot of issues. Now, are we going to get that? I don't know. But the line that Silicon Valley pushes against that kind of regulation is privacy inhibits innovation. It's like a bumper sticker, and you can tell when they've hired people to come on their side. Privacy inhibits innovation, which I think is bullshit, to like be perfectly frank about it. We're really good at innovating things, as academics and also on the corporate side. We can innovate just fine if we had better privacy laws. But I think we need to push harder on the academic side, and I'm thinking about this too, is like, how do we show some like really great innovation that works in a perfectly privacy respecting way? On the AI side, that's really hard because you just want data about people. But I think that's an important thing to kind of keep in your head. Like that's the line they're pushing, so show them that that's wrong. The other side of it, in terms of like the HCI side, is like people want control over this data. They want to be able to say no. We know that Facebook's not going to give you any of that control that they don't have to. So, what's the arms race that we can create there? We've done this before with like spam filtering, right? Like there are conferences about spam filtering in the kind of early 2000s. Like I went to a couple of these like when I was a graduate student, and we'd make new spam filters, and then they would do this, and then we'd make more spam filters. And now we don't talk a ton about spam filters. Not that there isn't good work going on, but we won on the spam filtering side. It's not a huge problem anymore. Can we create that sort of escalating thing in terms of these personalization algorithms, in terms of privacy? So, we were talking at the beginning about optimizing for well-being, for example. Could you have your Twitter feed just show you happy stuff? I don't think Twitter is going to do that. I certainly don't think like Facebook or Instagram will do it, but could you get a tool that sits on top of it that's going to do that filtering for you? And if that's how people are spending their time there, maybe that pushes the companies to kind of adopt some of that or give you those options. So thinking about what is it that people want, and then the kind of applied side, which I admit I am not good at. How do you build a tool that uses that research that we've done, that sits on top of and essentially lets people have the experience that they want, that they're not getting from the platforms? That may be something to drive this in a way that gets us to a better place. It's like I said, I'm not good at building those kinds of things that people are actually going to use. But for researchers on the HCI side, I would love to see more of that.
So I see that there are plenty of questions, and before I turn it over to Orit, I wanted to ask one more question, which is, the title is the good, the bad, and the ugly. So what's the bad and the ugly in being an influencer?
You get harassed all the time. I mean, especially me as like a woman. I think a woman, period, get harassed all the time. Not so much on the dog side. Occasionally someone creeps in, but certainly on the other accounts. And from all sorts of ways, right? Like some people it just get like, oh, honey, like maybe you just need to learn more about this, right? This sort of standard misogyny that I think a lot of women on the internet get, to like, you're really ugly and maybe people would listen to this more if there was someone attractive saying it, which, after this many years doing this, I'm like kind of used to, but still really sucks sometimes, where I'm just like laying in bed mad at some comment that somebody left, especially when they tell me that I'm dumb and I don't know what I'm talking about. Like it pushes a button for me. It drives me crazy. So there, I think, uh, especially being a woman, like there's a real mental health toll that can come with it, and you gotta be careful to not let it get to you and think about ways to kind of block or circumvent or get past, some of the really awful stuff that people say or do to you.
Thank you. So I really appreciate you kind of talking about the mental health aspect, the psychological aspect, and also kind of raising the conversations from the technical infrastructure and the algorithms to a matter of really values. So one question that I have before I'll take questions from the audience is how do we train kind of ethical influencers, right? Many of the choices that you made are kind of ethical choices as an influencer. And how can we reach out and really create this, like, here are values for an ethically responsible influencer?
Yeah, such a good question. I will plug, and now somebody else can put it in the chat if I get it wrong. So there's a great documentary that just came out, I think on Netflix, called Fake Famous. Is that the name of it? Someone can look it up for me, but it's a really interesting documentary, from some filmmakers who are like, I could totally make an influencer, and they bought all these fake followers. Like they had these kind of regular people say like, yeah, I deserve to be famous, and like, how do we create that and what's the impact of it? Really interesting. Oh, HBO Max, thank you. Yeah, so it's totally worth watching. Really interesting. And basically they got one of these people to be an influencer, and the other two kind of stopped for different reasons, but it explores these ethics, right? So like, do you want to be your authentic self? For me, that was really important. And so, there's things obviously that we intentionally keep off, right? Like we're very privacy conscious. So even though sometimes we're like filming when we're in bed in the morning, it's this very intimate piece of our lives. We think very carefully about like what goes on any of these platforms and what do we keep private. So, how much of your authentic self do you want in there? And then what are you willing to do to gain attention? So, I spend a ton of time looking at analytics, especially when I'm trying to grow a channel. I haven't tried very hard to grow the dog stuff, like it has just naturally grown. But I've been on TikTok the last, couple months, and especially with my professional account there, it deployed everything I know about how to make those algorithms work in my favor to get my stuff seen and grow that platform, sort of as a personal experiment, which has worked great. And I don't think I've done anything unethical there, but some people will take that further and, buy followers or pay for things or lie about things or whatever. So thinking about, what are you okay with? And, are you going to regret this? And some people are like, look, I just want to make money doing this. I want people to give me stuff. I'll say every product is great if someone will give it to me, which is an easy thing to do. I could have like a room full of stuff that people had sent me, that I don't even know about, but I push, and I choose not to do that. So really thinking about, what part of yourself are you selling with this? Essentially, if you're going to make money off of it, who are you going to take money from? What are you willing to do to get it? Like those, I think, are the questions to ask, and I always advise people make those decisions before they're in front of you to be made, right? Make the decision about what products you're going to endorse before you have an endorsement offer in front of you. Cause like that offer for $200 or whatever, get a percentage of this can be really tempting if it comes to you at the right point. But if you've got like a set of rules ahead of time, it makes it easier to say no to the stuff that you should.
Great. Thank you. This is helpful, and I wish it would be, shared more formally, especially with young influencers.
So for your students in the room, I teach a class at the University of Maryland called Becoming a Social Media Influencer. I'm teaching it online this summer. It's asynchronous, so anybody can take Maryland classes over the summer. There's no prerequisites, and we basically do this. Like you can start from scratch. You can take an account that we have, and we like do the process of like build you a following. Here's how to, you know, make the algorithms work for you, understand the analytics, build, you know, make good content. And, you know, I had lots of students when I taught this last summer end up with, you know, brand offers and giveaways and stuff coming to them at the end. But we also talk about, you know, all this balance and how to deal with harassment and all the other stuff. So if you do, you know, if you're actually thinking about working as an influencer, you know, you can spend a summer online with me building up your following and kind of talking more in depth about all this stuff. I think it's we call it scholarship in practice is how I'm able to teach this. And I think it's a class that we definitely should have more of. A ton of people, you know, want to be an influencer as their job. And it's a job, like it is work to do it. So learning, you know, how to do it well and carefully, I think is an important skill.
This is great. Thank you. And we have multiple questions about, I would kind of say, remaking, rebuilding, thinking about regulation. So I'm just going to take them kind of one by one. Let's start with Diana.
Hi. Thank you so much for this talk. This is really interesting. And I love social media. I love TikTok and all that. And as a young person, I sometimes, believe it or not, get my news from social media, as do a lot of people. And I've been thinking about the filter bubbles that comes with, because obviously the algorithms want us to click on things that we like. So, and I've been thinking, like, is this something that we as consumers of social media should be combating? Because I don't necessarily want to seek out, for example, alt-right content, but I also think it's a little strange when social media shows me things that reinforce my viewpoint instead of growing it. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, this is such a good question and really timely. So I just reviewed a book for Science Magazine, like we're in between like final edits and proof. So the book is called, I think, Breaking the Social Media Prism. Someone can Google it if I got the title slightly wrong. But it looks at this idea of like, are there echo chambers and filter bubbles and what's the impact of that? And like, say we try to counter it. So there's a lot of experiments in there. It's a very sciencey book. So the author did an experiment, for example, where he took people, thank you, I see that somebody just put in the link. Oh, that's you. So they took people and they took a person who described herself as sort of like kind of liberal, sort of supports some Democrat things, but sort of in the middle. Another one was like a pretty hardcore Trump supporter, spent hours a day, you know, expressing her opinion online, and put them in this experiment where essentially they had a bot that was giving them news articles from the other side. And what he found at the end of a month of having seen this is that both of them were more entrenched in their positions. The Trump supporter had moved further to the right. This kind of moderate liberal had moved far to the left, had embraced more Democratic positions than she had before, kind of in response. Like it was like a no, like more on my side. Which was really interesting. Like the experiments sort of showed that like, yeah, we are kind of seeing stuff that's filtered and curated for us, but just looking at stuff from the other side doesn't do anything to solve the polarization problem, which is the real issue. So, you know, to your point, I am personally pretty liberal, but will, you know, once a week or so check in on Fox News, which is about as far right as I can go. You know, I see all the Nazi stuff in my research, so I don't need to see that, but like I'll check in on Fox News just to sort of see what they're saying about stuff. I think it's good to know that perspective. I have a lot of family members who all they do is watch Fox News, so I kind of know what they're seeing. But there, you know, the question of like, how do you fix that problem? You know, the conclusion from the book is like they made this like mocked up social media platform where people have one-on-one conversations, and then like at the end of weeks of having one-on-one conversations with someone from the other side, like you were more moderate, which 100% doesn't scale. So like I think it's nice that if we talk to people on the other side, we kind of see their positions a little bit better, but that's not going to solve the problem. And I know exactly what would happen if you tried to deploy that at scale, what the Trumpies would say to me, right? I mean, they do say it to me. I get a lot of that. So, you know, does that solve the problem? I don't think so. Can we algorithmically solve it? I think algorithms have some responsibility for pushing us more to these extremes by sending us to those things, but I don't think the alternative is see stuff from the other side necessarily. You know, as someone who builds personalization algorithms, I think having some regulation that restricts the data that lets us build better personalization algorithms would be good. Like, I'd be happy for the personalization to be worse. You know, and like see some stuff that's maybe not what I'm all that interested in, but not be pushing people out to the extremes. But it's a really tricky technical problem. But in any case, if you're interested in this kind of filter bubble, echo chamber, and impact on polarization, the book was really nice. You know, even though I don't necessarily have as much hope as the author does for his solutions at the end, definitely worth checking out.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. So kind of, right, with filter bubbles, we had an assumption that the information we see is biased but real, but there are questions about handling misinformation. So Shaer, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. I'm a student of Professor Henny, and we did a lot of research with Section 230. And since then, like, I've had a lot of like questions about it. So my question was, is it the content creator's responsibility to filter out all of this misinformation from these platforms? Or do you think that the company should, you know, maybe kind of like adding like a third filter, or like having someone there to filter it out and make sure that misinformation or like dangerous information isn't found in the chat or comment section?
So I think that there's sort of responsibility all around. It's a great question. But I think, you know, because Section 230 has made things really hard in terms of getting companies to make the right decisions, because if they start very carefully curating things, they get themselves in trouble as like editors of information, right? They maybe become something else and not just a host. At the same time, like, while I am not a legal expert, I think it's personally nonsense to treat Facebook like a web host, right? Or like somebody hosting a blog. Like, their algorithm is making editorial decisions for everyone anyway. So with that as background, the social media companies, and this extends to Google too, right? That they're making these choices of like, look, maybe we'll put a little flag on something that we know is fake. We'll just put a little note there for people. And I understand why that's about as far as they're willing to go, but I also think it's nonsense. Like, they could make it way harder. So the example that I give is like, so we've done some projects on fake news in my lab. There's a ton of known misinformation sites. Like, the URL is known to be a site that's got a bunch of misinformation. There's also known misinformation creators. So there's just a study that came out, I think this week, that was looking at, and again, I don't have it in front of me, I think it was looking at vaccine misinformation. And it basically found that it spreads wildly on Facebook, but it's a small number of content creators that are producing the majority of that. Like 110 content creators were responsible for a huge percentage of it. So we know that there are sites and there are people that are consistently spreading that misinformation. They could take very definitive action to, thank you for that one. I love the chat, this is great. To just ban the people who are spreading the misinformation. You can ban people for whatever you want. It's clearly a violation of the terms. Kick them off the platform and keep them kicked off. It is a thing they know how to do, and they're choosing not to do it. So I think that's a thing that should be done. It's a small number of people and it would have a huge impact. You also could make it really hard to share this misinformation. They are almost perfect on Facebook at preventing child porn from being shared, because they have a legal obligation to do that, right? So you've studied 230, right? You don't get out of the child porn exempt. So they can stop child porn. So it's easier, like the work that they have to do to catch child porn is pretty sophisticated. They have to, you know, check all of those images and videos against a database as they're uploaded. To check fake news, all right, we know, low hanging fruit, we know a bunch of these sites. You could just make it so if I want to post a link to one of those sites, I could paste the URL in, and that's all it's going to do. Like, it goes on and it's like, here's the URL that Jen shared. It's not going to show you a preview, a picture, a headline. It's not even going to be clickable. You could totally copy and paste it if you want, but this is an HCI decision, right? You're putting a ton of work on the user to go see the bad content, but you're not banning it. You're just deciding like certain content is going to be harder to share. I think that kind of thing could be a really good solution, where they're not blocking it, they're not even commenting on it, they're just saying, okay, this is going to be harder to share. So, I think the responsibility lies in a lot of places, but I think the platforms have been particularly weak when they don't have to be. And there are these kinds of interface decisions that they can make that would actually have a huge impact. And that, as private companies that they're able to do that I think would sidestep any legal trouble, again, as a non-lawyer, but that would have a big impact on it. But for sure, a hard problem. But I think there's really straightforward things to do that would address a big percentage of it.
Thank you.
Thanks. It's a great question.
Thank you. And I think that Lori and Peter have related questions. So maybe kind of we'll ask them one after another. Lori, would you like to ask your question? Okay, I'm not sure if Lori is with us, but I can ask. So Lori was asking, what do you see for the future of social media? Is it just more different platforms and improvements? And Peter had a more specific question on the same topic. Peter?
Yeah, mine was, do you think that efforts to build decentralized social media platforms have any value in them, or are a way forward towards this, something like that post office idea that you mentioned?
I mean, I think a decentralized social media platform would be amazing. I think it would solve so much of this. At the same time, I feel like I've been talking about that for 15 years. Isn't this a thing we could do? And I think it is technically, I don't actually think it would be that hard to have a standardized data format, and for me to be able to easily get server space and be here's the stuff I'm going to share with whatever. That I think it's technically doable. Why hasn't it been done? Because you can't make a lot of money with that, right? Or you'd have to think very creatively, where there's so much money to be made now in personal data marketing. So yeah, I love that solution, and I would love to see someone kind of entrepreneurially minded work for it, because I think people would love it. They would really like being able to have that control, as long as it can be made in a way that's user friendly. There are these decentralized platforms out there now, or options for it, but nobody knows how to use them. So I like to use my husband as an example, right? He's a smart guy, lawyer, went to Harvard. I have to do all the tech support in the house, right? Which is fine. It's just he doesn't have that kind of tech savvy, and he's way more tech savvy than lots and lots of people. So how do we make a system like that usable? I totally think that's achievable. So I don't know that I see that on the horizon, but I hope, because I think it would be great. If you look at, so I have been asked my entire career what comes next for social media. What I have learned from many years of wrong answers is that essentially what's going to be successful is giving people the ability to create content in the way that they want. And so we saw a real shift to mobile. And then, we've seen some mistakes. I think dropping Vine was a really terrible idea, because that's basically what TikTok is. And it's just, allowed us to add in it's much easier to add in music and this and this and this. But that's feature evolution, right? We were clearly at a point where people wanted to create short videos and share them and browse them on Instagram. And TikTok just found a way to do that really nicely. So, do I see any big changes on the horizon? Probably not really. I think we'll see kind of shifting within the existing space, but I think 5 years from now we're going to have access to different kinds of tech that people really like using to make content, and that will drive probably another social media platform, and then the existing ones trying to copycat those features, which we see over and over again. So that's the not exciting answer, but yeah, I mean, Peter, to your point, I would love to see something distributed like that, and hopefully someone can figure it out. It would solve a lot of problems.
Yeah, so to follow up on that, so Jaron Lanier had a TED Talk recently of kind of titled "How to Remake the Internet," and his thesis was that the problem with what we're seeing now is that the model of free sell data for advertising, this is how you make money, and he said that's not necessarily how it should have gone. It could have gone with the Netflix model, in which you are subscribing for, we can discuss it, but for quality content that is not necessarily produced by everyone, but by the professional producers. And he suggested that if social media will charge something, we will see more of kind of expert content about vaccine, less of misinformation. I'm just kind of curious to see what you think about subscription model for social media.
I think paying content creators is a important model. So, you know, we talked about all the dog stuff. I have big platforms and lots of followers across social media platforms for the dogs, and make $0 doing it and make no money, even though we're like one of the bigger accounts on Snapchat at this point. You know, a lot of people have left, but like we are big on Snapchat at this point. We have hundreds of thousands of followers on Instagram and Twitter, and I get no money for that. I get paid on TikTok. You know, TikTok has a creator fund. So once you hit 10,000 followers, you can apply for the creator fund, and then you get paid by view. And it's not a little money. So I had one video like really hit and got like 4.5 million views, and I think I made $300 on that video. You know, on average, so my videos on average are getting 50,000 to 100,000 views, and I'm making 15 or 20 bucks a day, which, like, okay, it's like you can't necessarily live on that, but man, that would have been a big supplement to my income for a big part of my life. Like, it would have made differences in decisions about how I lived my life. You know, having been broke for an awfully long time, like that's 20 bucks a day is a lot of money. I spend way more time and make better content on TikTok because I get paid for it, you know, even though it's not a lot of money. If I'm like, what am I going to do now? You know what I'm going to do? A 60-second version of that 20-minute lecture video that I can repurpose for my class, because I know everybody doesn't watch all the videos. So I'm going to give them the TikTok version that at least I know they'll all watch those. I'm going to repurpose it for my class. I'm going to get paid by TikTok to create it. I'm going to be able to talk to the public about it. It completely changes the way I think about content creation. Now, that money is not coming from subscribers. That's, you know, a pool that TikTok has from their advertisers, which is brilliant because the content is great on TikTok, because, you know, people are putting in that kind of time because they can make money there. And I think we sort of see that on YouTube too. You know, I monetize some stuff on YouTube and it doesn't make as much as it does on TikTok, but still. So yeah, I mean, I think there's, you know, there are of course equity issues that come with this, right? Which are always at the forefront of my mind when we talk about paid models. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, I think being able to pay content creators and, you know, have that kind of control, you know, hopefully the fact that TikTok is doing this and they're really becoming a dominant platform for a lot of demographics, you know, shows more platforms that are going to get better content that way. And that can drive engagement, right? Instead of just, you know, algorithmically filtering things, if it's just like a lot of people in your fund are making really good stuff, you know, better content actually gets the best engagement.
Great, great. So let's move from kind of content producers to users. Alberta had a question about older generation users. So Alberta?
Yeah, so I was wondering if there was any way to equip social media users, especially the older generation, so that they can be more conscious of what they post and the data they share. So for example, this past year, I have introduced social media to my grandmother just to keep her close and engaged, but then I'm always worried about what she's reading and what she's taking from those sites, as well as what she's posted. So is there any way we can find a way to, I guess, regulate it or help them make the conscious decisions?
Yeah, that's such a good question. You know, I don't know of anything where I can be like, oh, of course you should just use this and like that will solve your problem. You know, the platforms have explored parts of this. So like Facebook, I know, has run experiments where like if you're about to post something that's false, it's going to give you a message first. It basically puts a speed bump in there. That's something, you know, and we talked about this in a previous question in terms of how do we reduce misinformation, thinking about what are those speed bumps that we can put in place. We've also seen that with content. So I had a PhD student who was looking at cyberbullying and looked at a similar thing. So what are kind of speed bumps you can put in place, like as an HCI question, that maybe will stop people from doing that? So she was looking, she did some really interesting work, like working with high school students and like, what are things that people do on social media that make you feel bad? And one would be like, they crop me out of the picture, right? So it's a group shot and I'm in the end, they crop me out. Like, it's so mean and it makes me feel so bad. And so she actually built it, you know, built a whole system that would that like sat on top of, I think Instagram at the time. And if they noticed you had cropped a person out of the picture, it would give you a little message that was like, hey, this might make somebody feel bad. Are you sure you want to do this? And it reduced the amount of bullying that's done. So these kind of speed bump interventions can be used in a lot of ways. Like we've seen them tested with misinformation. We've seen them done with bullying. There's also a great paper on kind of racial hate speech and like how bots can step in and reduce that. So we're kind of in the early days. I think like it's being experimented with. And of course, we would like to see some stuff just deployed, like anything to make it better. But in terms of the sharing, I think that's a direction that we want to think more about, because there's a lot of promise there, on platforms and then, third-party things that sit on top of it. In terms of data sharing, I don't know, like I want a tool, right, that's just going to tell you how much data you're leaking. And there's little bits of things here and there, but I just want one that's going to do it. Somebody please go make that. Like I suck at making things and I'm also not interested in it, but I would love to see something like that put out there to be like, hey, be careful, because, this thing that you just said, not only is it that thing that you're saying, it can be used for all this other stuff. I think that's desperately needed at this point. So I'm sorry, I can't tell you like a specific thing to use, but I think it is a really worthwhile space to spend a lot of time thinking.
And kind of following up, kind of thinking about the emotional, mental impact, Deirdre had a question about filtering and about moderating. So maybe kind of, Deirdre, if you can combine your questions together.
Yeah, so my first question was actually about third-party interventions for negative content like that. So I think that you really got at that, and I think that that's a very exciting space. My second question, building on that, for interventions that are coming either from a third party or from the social media site themselves, how do you think that interacts with the growing like mistrust of, traditional like authorities on the truth, and mistrust of, established news organizations, and the general growth of like conspiracy mindsets? And how do you think that social media platforms or third-party moderators should navigate that?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and such a big problem. So look, it depends who you're trying to speak to and what about, right? So like if we say we look at vaccines, there are, and whether we're talking about COVID vaccines or other stuff, all the vaccines that were around before that. So there are people who are just like, vaccines are evil, you shouldn't use them. They spread a lot of misinformation about it. And it's a small number of people. I mean, I think that's in the study that from the post that came up in the chat. It's a really small number of people spreading a lot of that misinformation, but they're very committed to it. And some of them are state actors, right? It's Russian operatives coming in and telling Americans not to get vaccines. There's not a damn thing you can do about those people. Like nothing you say is going to make a difference. Then there's people who are mistrustful or concerned for all sorts of reasons. I think COVID and the vaccine has really highlighted why like Black populations, for example, have a lot of hesitancy with vaccines, because they've been subjected to like some really awful mistreatment by the medical establishment and don't trust it. Like that's a reasonable mistrust that needs to be approached in a certain way. There's also people who are just confused. I think it's legitimate to be like, if every vaccine takes like a decade, this one we got in like a year, are we sure that this is okay to be taking? And there's a different way to talk to those kind of people, right? Where they may have trust in either institutions, the CDC says this, or celebrities, right? Tom Hanks gets his vaccine and that's going to make people feel better. That's why we saw all this public vaccine taking when it came out. So, there's ways to speak to them. But one other thing I'll add in here, which I kind of alluded to in the last answer, that's I think interesting to think about for a lot of reasons, is there's a really great study that was done that was looking at the impact of interventions on racial hate speech. So I think they were specifically looking for the use of the N-word on Twitter. And basically what the guy who did this pretty simple experiment did was create a bot that would come in, and if he saw that you had used that word, so it had a flag, in the API, it was just searching for the word. If you'd use the word, it would look back and see if you had used it before. So it was a word that you were regularly using. And if you were, it had a pre-programmed sentence that was just like, hey man, like when you use that kind of language, it can make people feel bad. Like maybe that's not a thing you should do. It wasn't like super aggressive, but it was like, have you not thought about this? Like, stop doing that. And so it would just respond with that. It looks like it came from a person, and it adjusted what the account looked like that it was coming from. And so basically it made no difference if you got a bot that looked like a woman tweeting that at you. And if you got a bot that looked like a man, if it was a man who was not white, it didn't matter. But if it was a white male looking account that came in and said that to you, it significantly reduced the amount of racial hate speech that came after. All right, so that suggests that interventions can work. It also suggests that the interventions have to come from white men, because it's white men who are misusing this kind of language, right? So that's really interesting. And it suggests, like, both from an HCI perspective, if you want to automate this, what are things to think about? Thinking about, like, what are trustworthy accounts? What looks trustworthy in terms of profile pictures, account names, like all of this sort of stuff. That's interesting. But it also speaks a lot to social intervention, right? A thing that I'm like yelling all the time, whether it's at like my husband, he sees a bad thing that somebody said online. I'm like, you, white man, have to go in and say a thing about that because it's your job. Like, it does speak a lot about the responsibility that non-marginalized groups have to combat, whether it's misinformation, hate speech, whatever. Like, if you have a position of social privilege, you have to use that and be the one who's like actively taking steps to call things out, which is like not pleasant. And you're not the one doing the bad thing in the first place. But if you put it on women or Black people to be the ones calling it out, people aren't going to listen to them in the same way. So that study, I think, was interesting for both reasons. Like, it does speak to automation and interesting like HCI questions, but also speaks to like the social responsibility of privileged groups to call out that kind of nonsense.
Jen, thank you so much for this conversation. This was an hour of my time that was just very enjoyable. You definitely influenced my thinking, and I think all of our thinking. So thank you very, very much for spending.
Oh, my pleasure.
So what I'll do is I'll just quickly announce next week we'll have Michel Bahut from Microsoft Research talking about his very interesting work with augmented reality, virtual reality, thinking about the future hybrid workspace. And I will stop recording, and then we can probably hang out for 3 more minutes.